you sure this is our destiny, Daniel? It feels like a storm is coming.
We face it together, Emma. That is my promise.
The day Daniel was crowned, the town of Willowmere forgot how to breathe. From the morning mist that clung to the mango trees to the glitter of white shirts in the market, everything paused to watch Daniel walk under the banner of honor. He wore the new title like a second skin, confident, careful, and faintly astonished by his own reflection. They draped him in a scarf embroidered with the town's emblem, the old river snake, and the people who had watched him grow from a boy into a man cheered until their throats were raw. Emma stood by his side, hands folded like a prayer. She was 26, luminous, quick-lipped, and terrible at hiding her feelings. Today, the entire town felt like an audience to their love. But the celebration was layered with cost. Daniel had promised Willowmere a feast that would signal their return to respect among the region's towns, and he had promised Emma something even rarer, a quiet life away from the bargaining and the long evenings of public courtesy. The music rolled into the night, and the drums reminded the old women of ancestors. Men ate and drank. The mayor spoke with an old man's voice. Gifts were passed like currency for future favors. As fireworks stitched the black sky into a tentative crown, Daniel and Emma retreated to a tent stitched from borrowed silks. They lay together and pretended the world could be molded by promises. Daniel's jaw showed the strain of new responsibilities. Emma saw it and tried to smooth it away with a laugh that sounded too small. That night, as the tent smoldered and children fell asleep on the cot beside their parents, Emma dreamed of the road. In her dream, Daniel's car tilted in the dark and the world spilled like water. She woke with the taste of iron in her mouth, a film of panic across her skin. In the dawn, she pressed herself to Daniel and begged, not with public diplomacy, but with the raw voice of someone terrified for one person that mattered more than history. Daniel listened, and then, in a voice trained to reassure others, promised he would not travel. He put his hand over her hair, kissed her brow, and left the conversation with words meant to close the room. "I'll stay, I promise." The promise settled like a warm stone between them, and they slept. Nobody in Willowmere could have guessed that promises are sometimes invitations for storms. When the sun rose, Willowmere seemed to want to keep yesterday's joy. Market women arranged plantain like trophies. The mayor walked with his chest a little higher. Yet by noon, Daniel was gone. He said there was a problem in the city that could not wait. A bank reconciliation, a meeting with an old benefactor, the type of grown-up errands that dress themselves as duty. Emma watched the taxicab swallow him at the crossroads, then stood in the doorway until the dust settled. She called him. He picked up with the chair of someone trying to hold back the ocean. He told her he might go in the night, but that he would be back before the next sunrise. It was a small lie wrapped in a protective coat. Maybe he was trying to spare her worry. Maybe he truly believed the words he spoke. Emma's dreams deepened. They arrived again at noon. Noon on the second day, when the sky had the soft, accusing gray of premonitions. She dreamed of him slumped by the roadside and of a black crow perched on a mirror. The dream lodged like a seed in her sternum and grew thorns. She called Daniel again and begged him, this time with the frantic edge that life sometimes lends to lovers. "Come back, postpone the trip, stay." Daniel's voice was calm, the same voice that had soothed townspeople for months, and he said, "Everything will be fine. There is nothing to fear." The line went still with his faith like a bell. Hours later, Emma sat in front of the television in the small living room. They had not yet learned to fail with furniture and memories. The newsreader's voice arrived citified and grave, a kind of neutral thunder. There had been a ghastly accident on the highway outside Willowmere. A truck and a car, carnage and fire. The report showed nothing of names, only images that clawed at the stomach. Emma stood as if the room had been physically rearranged. Friends came and spoke in muffled sentences. The mayor's car drew up and people began to move as if gravity had shifted. But she felt a strange, impossible steadiness within. A small, stubborn flame that refused to be put out. Emma knew two things. She had slept beside Daniel that very afternoon and she had held his hand as late as mid-afternoon. The television filled the room with slow, obedient disbelief. Rumors in a town have the speed of fire and the malice of wind. By evening, a version of the accident had reached every corner of Willowmere, embroidered with gossip until it gleamed with certainty. The funeral parlor was open before the sunset, draped in black cloth and smelling of lilies. Daniel's mother arrived like a figure in an old photograph, grief knitting her brows. Emma sat at the edge of the chair and watched the town prepare to mourn a man who sat in her head like a contradicting fact. People who loved Daniel cried openly. Others whispered about the cost of his feast, about whether honor comes with a price in blood. Voices rose and fell like tobacco smoke. Emma testified to those who asked, the aunt with a clipboard, the police with their notebooks, that she had seen Daniel alive, had held him, and had doubted the world's capacity for randomness. We were together, she said, and the room recoiled as if she had put a living man on trial. Contradiction is a currency no community accepts lightly. It unsettles the ledger between the world and the unseen. Some said she was in denial. Others suspected a cover-up. The town fell into two camps. Those who had seen Daniel's car burned along the highway, charred and unrecognizable, and those who believed Emma's steadiness, who watched her insistence and began to ask questions. The mayor, anxious to protect the reputation of Willowmere, called for composure. Still, the undertow of doubt flowed, and under the civil surface, the town's old superstitions flexed their muscles. That night, as a gallery of mourners came to pay respects, something stranger happened. People claimed glimpses of Daniel's figure walking by the funeral parlor, a silhouette that stepped through lamplight and dissolved into the mango trees. Some swore they felt a chill or heard a voice call their name. The preacher said it was grief. An old woman who had survived an illness that had been called a miracle said it was a sign. Emma slept poorly in the house that had been rearranged into a shrine for absence. She woke with bruises on her palms from holding the sheets. In the morning, she would face a procession, a casket, and the most dangerous force of all, a town that had decided on a story and meant to keep it. Willowmere had never held a funeral of such magnitude for one so young. The casket was lacquered black, the town hall lined with people who pressed forward like grain in a mill. Children were ushered out, men straightened collars, women dabbed eyes with fingers that smelled of perfume and poverty. The pastor spoke with measured grief about destiny and the fragile threads of life. Emma walked by the coffin and placed her hand on the polished wood. A hush crawled over the crowd like a tide retreating. She looked for any sign, a twitch, a breath, a residue of Daniel in the folds of his shirt. Her fingertips met only varnish and air, her lungs filled with the metallic taste of impossibility. Then, something impossible happened. As the pastor finished and the town began to sing, a faint tapping sounded at the chapel door. It was not loud, but it was deliberate, the kind of tapping one makes when they know their way into a room. Conversation stuttered, people turned. Slowly, the chapel doors opened and a man entered. He was disheveled, his suit dusty as if he had come from the road, and for a haunted second every face turned as if in a dream. He walked not like a ghost, but like a man with a secret that was too heavy to carry. Emma's world condensed to the weight of his shoulders. She knew him before the crowd could name him. The man that stepped forward was Daniel. The chapel stilled as if the air had been restitched. Friends who had been crying sat up as if their grief had been an elaborate rehearsal. The pastor's expression moved from solemn duty to bewilderment. The mayor's jaw dropped. Complete silence is a rare beast in Willowmere, and the silence now had an edge of panic. Emma's body moved before her reason did. She ran to him as people parted like a sea. Their embrace was not cinematic or staged. It was raw, messy, and full of the small, unanswerable questions that love keeps like secrets. Daniel's eyes were present, dark with a memory Emma could not read. He whispered, "They said I was dead," and the chapel folded in on itself. The town's ledger wobbled, became a dangerous thing. Reality had been contradicted in public, and contradictions demand settlement. News that Daniel had appeared at the funeral spread faster than a fever. Phones lit up like lanterns, and social feeds filled with pictures and whispered captions. The report was immediate. Daniel had come to the chapel, alive and speaking, asserting a truth that broke the town's neat narrative. The mayor called for calm, the pastor called for a prayer, and the police called for patience. Meanwhile, television vans, always hungry for drama, were already weaving through Willowmere's narrow roads. The city's journalists tasted something they had not felt in years. A story that braided superstition, grief, and the improbable like threads of gold. Daniel told the chapel that he had been traveling to the city and that he had returned earlier than planned. He claimed to have postponed his original trip and to have been in town the whole time. People who had seen a burnt car recognized the photos on the news and began to shout. Some accused him of trickery. The police, bewildered, asked for identification and proof. Daniel produced things familiar to anyone who knows a man deeply. A coin he'd kept since childhood, a scar on his right thumb from a market stall, a letter from Emma he still hadn't opened. Memory is a poor arbiter in a town that relies on sight. Forensic evidence, burnt metal and charred fragments held more persuasive currency than a man's recollection. Emma, though, stood in a different light. Her insistence that Daniel had been alive beside her the afternoon before became a kind of anchor against the sea of proof. People began to ask if Daniel was truly alive, whose body had been recovered from the highway. If Daniel had been in town, why did the hospital records show a different name? The town's superstition rewired itself into complicating logic. Spirits are known in Willowmere to borrow faces, to test loyalties. The older ones told stories of men who had walked backwards into a town and left their shadows elsewhere. Young journalists called it a hoax. Daniel's mother wept in confusion, then turned to stone. The dead are usually beyond defense. The living are messy and maddening. In the days that followed, Willowmere divided itself like a cracked pot. Some called Daniel a miracle, others a scam. Emma moved through the crowd as if she were wearing a fragile thing, the only proof in a world that had refused to keep simple truths. People came to her house, bearing questions and small consolations. They wanted to touch the life that had contradicted death. A television crew set up a tent outside the mayor's office and spoke to anyone who would answer. Hashtags trended in the city. Hashtag Daniel returns. Hashtag Willowmere mystery. Online, opinions stacked like the market's crates, one on top of another, until reality at times felt buried. Then the world tilted again. Reports surfaced of another funeral in a nearby district, a funeral conducted with the same details as the deceased at Willowmere's highway, the same burnt metal, the same license plate number, the same fragments. In that town, the body had been identified by relatives as belonging to Daniel's younger cousin. Daniel, a man with a similar face, older and with a scar the family recognized. It was the kind of twist that leaves people rubbing their temples and reaching for religious metaphors. Some called it mistaken identity. Some said the dead had multiplied like mirrors. The pastor suggested a simple explanation. In a world where grief makes monsters of the living, we cling to anything that looks like closure. The old women shook their heads and told stories of spirits that take what they wish and leave behind a riddle. Emma, however, could not accept the neatness of second-hand details. She began to dig. She visited the hospital records, spoke to the coroner, and walked the highway with a sticky notebook at her side. Each step felt like a negotiation with a reality that wanted to be absolute. Daniel accompanied her in public, a strange presence that attracted both pity and suspicion. Together they revisited the site where the burnt car had been found. The road smelled of diesel and dust. Daniel stared at the place where the metal had been reduced to bones and said nothing for a long time. Then very softly, "I remember being somewhere else. I remember a crowd. I remember fire that wasn't mine." The memory was thin as tissue paper, but it suggested something that logic could not easily fold. An event had occurred that resided in more than one domain of truth. Willowmere's elders convened in a meeting that smelled of palm wine and old tobacco. They sat in a ring and recited the town's list of proper steps: honor the dead, respect the living, and settle disorder before it spreads. In the middle of the meeting hung an unspoken fear. If reality could be disputed so publicly, the town's foundations of trust would crack. The elders decided to call in an emissary from the regional council, someone both politically savvy and culturally literate. They wanted a figure who could mediate between facts and faith. Meanwhile, a different drama took stage. Daniel received anonymous notes slid under his door, notes that said things like "return to the road" and "some doors must be left closed." The handwriting was smudged, the ink uneven, and every note smelled faintly of smoke. Emma and Daniel, under the weight of whispers and the camera lenses that seemed to sleep on their stoop, tried to build a public narrative that might save them both. They staged interviews where Daniel recounted the tedious facts of meetings and travel plans. They posted photos of themselves in market to show their life's ordinariness. But the more ordinary they tried to be, the more the extraordinary persisted. At night, Daniel's dreams were jagged fragments, a face in the smoke looking back at him, a hand reaching through grillwork, a river that flowed uphill. He woke with palms clenched and a mouth that tasted of someone else's fear. Emma, who had been a woman who trusted her intuition, began to see patterns. She kept a small notebook in which she drew a map, not of streets, but of the places that seemed to hum with a strange energy. The old well by the market, the abandoned train depot, the mango tree behind the town hall. Each day, she crossed a place off the list and noted whether Daniel remembered standing there. One evening, in the humming heat, an old woman called Mrs. Carter, a seeker known for tea and cryptic counsel, came to the house. She smelled faintly of ginger and burnt orange. She sat and asked one question that seemed simple but was a key. What do you fear most, that he is gone or that he never left? Emma had no answer that fit the old woman's grammar. Daniel, however, found his voice. I fear I cannot account for moments in my life. The old woman's eyes, which had seen the town's long litany of oddness, narrowed. Then someone is collecting those moments, she said, and collectors demand payment. Rumors became theories, and theories became headlines. An investigative journalist from the city published a piece titled "Willowmere's Vanishing, Spirits, Scams, or Something Else." It was the kind of article that turned the town into a set of dramatic frames and reduced human complexity to clickable sentences. The piece included interviews, photos, and a timeline that tried to square the impossible. The city's intellectuals speculated about cognitive bias. The spiritualists quoted old proverbs about the river that keeps what people through to it. On the ground in Willowmere, sympathy turned brittle. Strangers arrived with the lenses of belief and the appetite of tourists expecting spectacle. Willowmere, a town that had lived long enough to prefer small secrets, found itself standing naked in the street. The mayor asked Daniel to submit to a simple test, a list of places he could confirm he had been and the names of people who had seen him. Daniel complied, but the test felt simple because the hole in the middle of the story was not in locations but in memory. Something had fractured Daniel's account of time and place. He recalled being with Emma in the afternoon, but then flashes of a different day, of heat and people and fire, invaded his mornings as if two lives had overlapped. Emotionally, the town recoiled. Legally, the police demanded identity confirmation. Daniel produced documents, and his mother vouchsafed childhood stories that could not be bought or faked. Still, evidence from the highway persisted. The burnt car had been found with a body that forensic experts tentatively identified as Daniel by dental records. Forensic certainty, however, is a logic that shies away from paradox. At dusk, Emma sat beside the old well and threw in a pebble. The water took the sound and returned a softer, echoing tone, as if the town's secrets were echo chambers. She thought of the people who loved Daniel before honors and wealth arrived, of the boy who sold coconut slices from a cart to send his sister to school. She remembered the way he had come home once, soaked from rain, and cleaned his mother's pots, as if that small kindness could stitch a life. The memories were tactile and true. Emma's conviction hardened into action. She would not allow a narrative stitched by fear to eclipse the man she knew. She began to call the witnesses she had not yet spoken to: the mechanic who fixed Daniel's motorcycle last month, the woman who sold Daniel his first suit. Each story added a brushstroke to a picture that refused simplification. Daniel's life was entangled in common things, and those common things recoiled at being discarded as illusions. Late one night, a stranger came to Emma at her kitchen table. He was tall and anonymous, his voice a soft rumble, his eyes like dark marbles that took light without giving it back. He introduced himself as Elias, a name that carried the sort of invitation that asked nothing and promised everything. He claimed to be a traveler who collects odd stories for a private archive. No press, he said, no spectacle. He had turned up in towns like Willowmere before, where reality had frayed at the edges and left mysteries to pick at like stitches. There are things that pass through a town, he said, and leave behind questions that look like prayers. Emma, by now accustomed to strangers, listened and offered him tea. Elias declined and sat anyway, his attention focused on the photograph of Daniel that sat on Emma's counter. He told them about a phenomenon he called double shadowing, moments when a person's presence exists in two or more states simultaneously, as if someone had borrowed a life long enough to leave a mark. He spoke not in the melodrama of superstition, but in the slow, sober tone of someone who had catalogued the world's odd corners. When something is taken, a replacement is often left, he said. Sometimes the world confuses names, sometimes the wrong body answers the ledger. Emma's hands tightened around her mug. Daniel, who was listening from the doorway, felt a strange stirring inside him. The idea of double shadowing made a kind of sense. It accounted for burnt cars and living men, for funerals disrupted by the living. Elias warned them of a collector that didn't ask for money but for memory, a force that would take what you feared to keep balance. That night, after Elias left, the house felt like a ship in fog. Daniel and Emma lay awake and spoke quietly about childhoods, about debts of honor, and about what a man owes his town. They spoke of how ceremonies make life visible and how visibility sometimes invites the strange. Emma admitted something she had not said aloud. She felt fear, yes, but she felt something stronger, a knowledge that their story did not belong to Willowmere alone. The next morning they walked to the market together and noticed things they had not before, shop signs with names that echoed old proverbs, the eyes of children who watched in a manner that suggested recognition rather than mere curiosity. A child selling beads asked Emma in a solemn voice if she believed in spirits. She answered, without thinking, that she believed in love and facts of life. The child looked at Daniel and smiled in a way that implied allegiance. Willowmere's regional council visited as requested by the elders. The emissary, a lean woman named Margaret, arrived bearing official paperwork and the posture of a mediator who had seen too many towns collapse under rumors. She listened to both sides and declared that a public inquiry would be held. The inquiry would gather testimonies, review records, and, crucially, produce a report the town could use to restore equilibrium. Journalists sharpened their pens. Camera crews prepared to frame reality for their viewers. Margaret's calm, however, could not still the deeper current. Superstition is not something that bureaucrats can simply file away. As the inquiry proceeded, other stories began to bubble to the surface. People came forward with unsettling accounts of missing hours and second-hand sightings. A schoolteacher said she had once seen a man in the old train depot who later appeared across town as someone else. A barber reported that a customer had woken up mid-haircut with mud on his shoes and no memory of leaving the chair. Each anecdote was like a knot in a long rope, and the rope ran through Willowmere's collective memory. The inquiry's first day ended with no certainties, only a map of confusion that hinted at old rights and new mechanisms of exchange. Margaret, who had a pragmatic mind, suggested a more concrete step: a DNA test on the burnt remains and a careful review of official records that could clarify the identity of the deceased. DNA, for all its clarity, is not always a merciful thing. The lab in the city reported back that the remains on the highway did not belong to Daniel, but matched a person who had once been an anonymous migrant worker, someone with similar features but a separate life. The news should have solved the problem, but it complicated the moral ledger. Who had been buried in Willowmere's casket? Families looked at each other like strangers. Daniel's mother paced like a woman who had been given a puzzle with missing pieces. The town's elders whispered that the world had become too clever at hiding its machinery. And somewhere, beyond paperwork and science, a force, patient, old, and uninterested in human definitions, continued to move pieces on a board only it could see. Not all answers come from science or law. On the 20th day after Daniel's supposed death, Emma received a package with no return address. Inside was a small wooden box carved like a bird's nest. Within the nest was a coin she recognized. The coin Daniel kept in his pocket since childhood, and a scrap of cloth singed at the edges. Tucked beneath them was a note in a hand that trembled as if the writer had been holding a fever. The note read, "Look under the mango that stands behind the old school." It was the kind of direction that could be a prank or a map. Emma woke Daniel, and together they walked to the mango tree that overlooked the school playground, where children still swung on ropes despite the town's drama. The earth under the tree was soft and smelled of old summers. They dug with their hands until fingers bled and found not treasure, but a bundle of cloth tied with twine. Inside the bundle was a small book, its pages filled with careful script and sketches that suggested a method, names paired with places, small icons next to entries, an eye for vision, a flame for loss, a bell for memory. The book was a ledger of moments. Emma recognized the handwriting of Elias, the traveler, but the dates went back decades, spanning towns and people whose names had drifted into whispers. The ledger suggested that Willowmere's odd event was not unique, but part of a pattern. They took the ledger to Mrs. Carter, who nodded slowly as she flipped each page. She said these are inventories of what was taken and what was left. People think spirits take flesh or wealth. Sometimes they take the thin parts, the hours, the names, the single lines in a life that make a person unique. Emma felt vindicated and terrified. The ledger suggested that someone or something collected moments to feed itself, storing them across geographies. Daniel, who had been asked since the beginning to recount his movements, felt the ledger's presence as both accusation and plea. If a collector existed, what did it want? And if he wanted memories, could they be bargained with? That night, Emma read the ledger in the flicker of a candle and realized it contained a pattern of exchange. For each moment taken, there was a substitution, a body, a rumor, a misaligned record. The substitutions were not random. They had a rhythm, a logic. Emma's skin prickled with the sense that they had been invited into a game with rules they had not yet learned to read. She wrote a single word on the margin of the page, return. The word felt like a promise and a challenge. If they could understand the ledger's rhythm, perhaps they could unpick the knot in their life. If they could not, perhaps Willowmere would remain a town that told tall tales to explain the unexplainable. Emma and Daniel decided to confront the ledger's logic by retracing its entries. Each entry was a small shrine of an event, and each shrine seemed to hum when they stood near it. They visited places the book listed. The train depot where a nameless man once waited for a delayed carriage. The old well where secret letters had been hidden. The market stall where a woman had once pawned her wedding ring. Each place left the couple with the sense of being watched not by people, but by time itself. They found fragments of meanings. A bell tied to the old well, a child's shoe in the train depot, a coin stuck between the boards of a market stall. Each fragment felt like a debt someone else had been called to pay. As they walked, Daniel's memories returned in tatters. He began to recall snatches of a life he didn't know he had. A road with no turn, laughter that belonged to a stranger, a hand that shoved him through smoke. He would come home and write notes to himself as if memory was a foreign language he was learning. Emma, in turn, kept the ledger safe as if it were a map to a buried city. People began to gather at their doorstep, not always friendly. Some wanted proof for the city's cameras, others wanted absolution. A woman from the neighboring district, whose brother's funeral had been mistakenly linked to Daniel, demanded an apology. The town was full of small hot things. One night, a visitor arrived who would change everything. Margaret, the emissary from the regional council, returned with a pale scholar named Dr. Hayes, who studied folklore and cultural memory. He said if you have a ledger, you have rules. He suggested a ritual of restoration, one based on both the town's traditions and a methodical, practical logic. Identifying the entry, meeting the place, and offering an appropriate exchange. Not payment necessarily, but recognition. The scholar's proposal was not magical in the way Willowmere knew magic. It was procedural, almost bureaucratic in its own spiritual respect. The town responded with relief and skepticism. It liked the idea of doing something tangible. The first ritual was simple: a public naming at the well, where residents would speak aloud the names of those who had been miscounted by their lives. They lit candles and recited the stories the ledger suggested: who had been taken, what had been left in their place, and what the town remembered. People wept and cheered in the same breath. As the last name was spoken, something subtle and shifted in the air. Not miraculous, but a tightening, as if a knot had been pulled taut. Daniel felt a warmth in his chest and a memory drop into place like a coin into a slot. He remembered a face in the smoke who had not been him. He remembered a mouth that had whispered, "Take what you must." The ritual had not undone everything, but it had given the town a method to proceed. For the first time since the accident, Willowmere had a step to perform that felt intentional rather than reactive. The rituals continued and the ledger reduced its list slowly, as if each ritual carved an apology into the world. People who were skeptical came forward with their own small tales of misaligned days. A barber admitted that a customer had asked about a daughter he had never had. A baker confessed to seeing a stranger in his oven who later appeared in another town. Each confession felt like a weight lifted from someone's chest and placed on the collective altar of Willowmere's new truth. Still, the ledger's pattern indicated something more ominous. The collector gathered not just moments, but the kinds of moments that mattered most. Wedding vows, final words, moments before death. It did not take trivial things. Emma and Daniel, now seen as warier guardians of the town's balance, became reluctant stewards of each ritual. They led people to the places in the ledger and helped read the names aloud. In doing so, they acquired a kind of authority that felt both heavy and righteous. The town's trust, once threatened, shifted into guarded respect. But power always summons consequences. A man named Harold, once close to the mayor and now excluded after the financial burdens of the crowning, saw the ledger as a way to return old favors. He began to murmur about loopholes and about how rituals could be used to settle scores. Emma watched Harold with a new kind of vigilance. People will try to use anything, even the grieving, as an instrument. Meanwhile, Daniel's sleep became a theater of fragmented scenes. He dreamt of a hall of doors, each with a person behind them complaining of absence. He dreamt of a man who collected memories with gloves and catalogued them in jars. He woke with names on his tongue that he did not recognize, and the sudden urge to return something that he could not name. One day, while walking past the market, he found a young boy staring at him with a certainty that unnerved him. The boy said simply, "You have someone's laugh." Daniel laughed, then stopped. The boy's observation landed like a stone. Perhaps the collector could be appealed to in the language it understood, the language of exchange. If items were sometimes substitutes, maybe substitutes could be returned. If moments had been borrowed, they might be given back. An idea took shape, risky and simple. If the ledger tracked losses and substitutions, perhaps one could negotiate with the collector by offering something of equal presence, not gold or cattle, but a living truth, a pain acknowledged in public, a right word spoken aloud in the place where the theft first happened. With Dr. Hayes' cautious blessing and the elders' reluctant permission, Emma proposed a new ritual, the Day of Return. On that day, each family who had lost an essential moment would go to the ledger's places and perform the truth, openly acknowledge what was gone and offer what remained. It was not a bargain in the commercial sense, but an exercise in careful honesty. The town prepared. People practiced speeches, polished heirlooms, and rehearsed names they had left untold. Some scoffed, some prayed. The television crew returned, which ensured the Day of Return would be framed and broadcast to the country. When the day arrived, Willowmere gathered at dawn in the market square and walked to the marked places like a people performing a pilgrimage. Emma led the procession. Daniel walked beside her, holding her hand as if the touch could make their story more real. They opened the ledger at the place where the burned car had been found and spoke publicly of the man they loved and the life they wanted back. The air held the sound of names like a loosed flock. At the conclusion of the ceremony, something small and precise occurred. A gust of wind rolled across the square, and a single scrap of paper, previously buried under the stall of a fruit seller, rose and unfolded like an old map. On it was written a line Daniel had never spoken aloud until that moment. It read, "Return what was borrowed." The paper's appearance did not solve everything, but for many in Willowmere, it felt like the first chapter in a second book. The day of return was both a ritual and a signal to the collector. Willowmere would no longer be fodder for randomness. They had learned to name things, to gather witnesses, and to insist upon a kind of fairness that even a collector might respect. The town's stance hardened. Willowmere sent emissaries to neighboring towns and even a plea to the city's Cultural Heritage Department asking for counsel and witnesses who knew old rights. Most replies were polite rejections or academic footnotes. But a surprising ally arrived, a woman named Lydia, whose brother had vanished in a similar manner years before. She brought with her a box of objects, trinkets and tokens that the ledger suggested had been left at various times when a life was misaligned. Lydia's eyes were steady. Her presence was the sort of quiet power that eases the most stubborn of griefs. She told Emma and Daniel about the way her brother used to whistle when he walked, about the way he pressed his thumb against a coin for luck. She spoke with a tenderness that made the ledger's items feel like relics rather than curiosities. Together, they matched objects to entries and tried to build a ritual not only of return but of restoration. For some families, restoration was literal. A name returned, a voice recorded, a photograph found, small miracles of proof. For others, the ledger suggested a different approach, the giving of an honest day, where a person confessed a truth they had been hiding. The idea was dangerous and strangely humane. Secrets are powerful, and admitting them publicly could unmoor more than just stolen memories. It could topple reputations and families. Yet people came forward. A man admitted to stealing a neighbor's goat. A woman confessed to withholding news of his sickness. The town's clean white collages of respectability peeled away to reveal human things: fear, greed, and kindness. Harold, who had been watching like a man who kept a ledger of his own, tried to manipulate the events. He suggested trades and clownish barter. He would return a small time if the mayor would grant him a contract. The elders saw the threat and acted. Harold's games did not fit the ledger's language. The collector, if it was a collector, did not respond to bribes offered in the currency of bureaucracy. It responded to authenticity. The town's transformation reached a crescendo when a woman named Sarah, who had been quiet through the entire drama, stood before the gathered people and declared a truth. She had loved Daniel in secret when both were teenagers, and she had never told him because she feared the fallout. The confession folded a tenderness into the town's noise, and the ledger's pages glowed, if only slightly. It was not the kind of resolution one imagines in tales. It was softer, more humane, and accordingly, more dangerous. As Willowmere busied itself with rituals, strange things began to happen at night. People reported candles extinguishing themselves in mid-prayer, mirrors fogging into images that were not reflections but suggestions. A rooster crowed in the market at midnight, and the river behind the town sang as if someone had opened a jar of voices. The ledger's items seemed to vibrate with a life of their own. Emma found a Daniel's old shirt on the veranda one morning, but she could not remember leaving it there. Daniel found himself humming a tune he did not know, and then realized it belonged to the child of a woman who had, years ago, lost a laugh to the ledger's economy. The town was stitching itself back together in threads that were not always neat. With each successful ritual, Daniel regained pieces of his timeline. He remembered a marketplace argument he had with a stranger, a hand that pulled him from a doorway, the smell of diesel on a road that was not the highway. He began to keep a journal, and started speaking at gatherings about the importance of witnesses. He said, "We need to remember the small things as fiercely as the big ones." People listened. The televisor cameras caught the line of his jaw and the steady cadence of his voice. Slowly, public perception softened into a more complex shape. Daniel became less a miracle and more a man in the middle of a strange and costly rehabilitation of his life. But not all recovery was peaceful. Harold's sabotage attempts escalated. He smashed jars that the Ledger families kept as talismans and spread rumors that Emma had orchestrated the entire spectacle for attention. Late one night, Harold confronted Daniel in the market, pushing and shouting. What Harold did not anticipate was the town's reaction. Shops closed their shutters, men emerged from stoops with machetes, and the old women who had once knitted the town's small politics together came forward and pinned Harold with a look that would have felled younger men. He was forced to apologize publicly and to return the broken jars. The town's anger was not merely in defense of Daniel or Emma. It was in defense of the principle they now cherished, that memory is not to be toyed with. Harold's humiliation functioned as a kind of public lesson. The ledger, now thick with new entries, pointed to a place beyond Willowmere, an abandoned colonial house on the edge of a neighboring district, its plaster cracking and its windows like blind eyes. The book named it as a node of past thefts, a place where remnants of borrowed moments had been held. Emma, Daniel, Lydia, and Dr. Hayes planned an expedition with care, like people approaching a site of historical excavation. They took offerings, small honest things, and the camera crews came with permission. The house stood solemn against a sky scraped flat by heat. Vines clinged to its bones, windows gaped like questions. Inside, they found artifacts that matched ledger entries, a child's whistle from a town miles away, letters written in a trembling hand, a jar of hair tied with a ribbon. Each item had been cared for as if the collector prized its quality. Dr. Hayes suggested that the place served as a kind of hold for things the collector could not immediately carry away. But the house had a guard, a figure who moved through the dark like a shadow that did not belong to any one person. The figure watched the group, then stepped forward. He was not a villain in the way stories make villains. He was old and tired and wore the look of someone who had done his duty too well. He introduced himself as Mr. Bale, a caretaker with no origin and a memory full of names. He claimed not to be the collector, but to have been charged with watching the things the collector could not take for reasons he could not explain. He spoke in measured tones. You think an answer will set you free, but collectors are not thieves in the human sense. They are keepers of balances. You are asking for a reckoning that will demand a return. The group caught between relief and dread, realized the ledger had always been a device for negotiation. Mr. Bell led them to a small room where jars lined the shelf and labels curled like old leaves. Each label was a name and a date. He handed back an object to Lydia, her brother's whistle. Lydia wept as if the sound of his breath had been returned. The further they dug into the house's rooms, the more complicated their moral currency became. Some items could be returned without cost: a whistle, a coin, a photograph. Others demanded an exchange of privacy, an admission, or an act of community service. The collector's economy operated not in money, but in truth. To retrieve a moment stolen at the height of a person's sorrow, the town might have to perform a sacrament, to kneel, confess, and take responsibility. To take back a wedding vow might require remaking a promise publicly. The demands were not arbitrary. They were precise and tailored. Mr. Bale, who had watched these negotiations for years, said, "You cannot walk into another life and pull out what you want without offering something in return." When Emma asked why the collector chose some moments and not others, Mr. Bale answered in a way that felt like both myth and ethics. It takes what is easy to remove and leaves what anchors a life. It takes moments that are valuable because they hold people together. The realization was brutal. The ledger targeted the fragile seams of connection: last words, newly made promises, last embraces. The couple learnt that the collector did not hate life. It simply fed on what made life sacred. To heal, Willowmere had to repair those seams in public and with honesty. It was a tall order. But with each item returned, with each ritual performed, the town gained something rare, a practice of truth. Back in Willowmere, their smallest ritual had ripple effects. Couples renewed vows in market squares. Parents told their children stories of their past and read names aloud that had been forgotten. The television coverage, initially sensationalist, began to focus on human stories of repair rather than spectacle. A city professor gave a talk about cultural memory and how societies guard their most fragile moments. The country watched as Willowmere performed its experiments in humility. Daniel and Emma, who had become unlikely spokespeople for the movement, realized that people were less interested in the supernatural than in the ways a community could be restored. In a strange way, the collector had given them a vocabulary for repair. Months passed and Willowmere changed in ways small and profound. The town began to host monthly gatherings called Night of Names, where people spoke aloud the things they had been afraid to say. Markets boomed as visitors came to witness a town that had discovered ritual as a remedy. Daniel wrote columns in the local paper about the ethics of remembering. Emma organized workshops teaching people how to record familial histories so no moment could be taken without witnesses. Dr. Hayes compiled a paper that argued the collector's actions were less about malice and more about reminding humans that memory is communal, not private. Lydia's family, having received her brother's whistle, opened a small foundation to help families document lost moments. But success breeds new attention. The city's skeptical circles accused Willowmere of staging drama for tourism. Political figures suggested legislation to regulate rituals. Journalists hunted for sensational angles, and Harold, who had been punished publicly, tried to reinsert himself into the town's affairs with a repentant smile. Through it all, Daniel and Emma held the steady belief that what they had done mattered beyond headlines. They had not only reclaimed a life, they had built a culture of witness. Yet, under all their civic pride rested a quieter fear. The collector, whatever it truly was, had not been defeated. It had only been negotiated with. One night, late, a package arrived for Emma. Inside was a small piece of cloth and a single burnt note that read, "Balance continues. Always give witness." The handwriting was shaky and older than any they recognized. Emma felt a chill that was not dread but alertness. Maybe the ledger would always find things to correct. Maybe the collector had widened its scope to teach. For the first time, she understood a larger lesson. Communities can build protections that make theft harder, but they cannot make themselves immune to existential forces that remind them of their fragility. The story, it seemed, was not about ending the collector's work, but about learning to live with the knowledge it demanded. Years later, Willowmere would be remembered as the town that taught a country how to speak its truths. The mango tree by the school became a place parents brought children to hear names. The ledger, now housed in a small sunlit museum, was handled only by those with clean hands and open hearts. Daniel, older and tempered by the strange apprenticeship of his life, became an ambassador not only to the neighboring districts, but to the idea that memory must be defended. Emma continued to hold their home as a refuge for those whose lives had been miscounted. They had a child, a laughing boy with Daniel's eyes and Emma's stubborn chin, and he would run through the market with a whistle Lydia had gifted him. Their story did not end with a clean cinematic reveal. There was no final vanquishing of the collector, no triumphant parade of science over myth. Instead, Willowmere learned to practice presence. They recorded births and deaths in ways that celebrated the ordinary. They taught children songs that named the days. They made public spaces where promises could be witnessed by neighbors rather than hidden behind closed doors. In the quiet hours, Daniel would sometimes sit by the riverside and think of the man he might have been in the roads burned and the names misaligned. He felt gratitude for the life he kept and sorrow for the lives that had been used as substitutions. The ledger remained, and once in a while, a new entry arrived, a name someone wished to have remembered. On the anniversary of the night Daniel re-entered the chapel, the town gathered not to celebrate the miraculous, but to give thanks for the slow, patient work of remembering. Emma stood in the middle of the square, and read aloud the names from the ledger as she had done so many times before. And when she reached Daniel's name, the whole town responded not with a gasp, but with a chorus. They spoke memories, small, specific, stubborn, the way a people speaks to itself across years. In those names, in those remembered details, the collector's appetite found its match. The town's refusal to let moments go unloved. The legend of Daniel and Emma became not just a tale of ghosts or miracles, but a teaching tale, a folk tale for modern times about how a community can rebuild itself when it remembers to witness one another.